The key question is, what were the state of relations between Napoleon and Bismarck by 1866? In 1870, Emperor Napoleon III declared war on Prussia. The Franco Prussian War was to have huge results for Prussia, Germany, France, and Europe. According to the British statesman Benjamin Disraeli, it was a greater political event than the French Revolution of last century. The balance of power has been entirely destroyed. Who or what was responsible for the war, and why did the Prussians win? The international situation in 1866 was far better than Bismarck might have expected. Britain generally welcomed Prussia's dominant position in Central Europe, regarding it as a welcome counterweight to both France and Russia. Russia was pleased that it had a reliable partner against Austria, and Austria was absorbed with the problem of dealing with its various subject nationalities, especially the Hungarians, and was not in a position to mount a war of revenge. The only real threat was France, unpredictably led by Emperor Napoleon III. Bismarck knew that Napoleon was likely to oppose the establishment of a powerful German state that would dominate Europe east of the Rhine and pose a threat to French security. The motives behind Napoleon III's foreign policy are difficult to determine. He seems to have wanted simply to restore France to a position of influence in Europe through peaceful means if possible, but the difficulty he had in making a decision and sticking to it made him appear inconsistent and unpredictable. Unlike his uncle Napoleon I, he lacked the ruthlessness and the will to carry things through to their logical conclusion. This put him at a marked disadvantage when dealing with a man as devious and determined as Bismarck, who was likely to outplay him at his own game. Louis Bonaparte was born in 1808. He was the son of Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland, and brother of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. He grew up in Germany and Switzerland, and by the 1840s began to think of himself as the person that would reestablish the Bonaparte family. Many of those who have written about Napoleon III have been less than flattering. He can be seen as a promising much but achieving little. He can be criticized for replacing a democratic republic with an authoritarian regime. Some see the disastrous Franco Prussian War as the fitting finale to a corrupt, incompetent regime. But Napoleon III had his admirers. Arguably, the catastrophe of 1870 and 71 obscured many of his achievements. He can be seen as far-sighted and pragmatic leader, keen to reconcile the desire for liberty and democracy with the principle of order. As a champion of the principle of nationality, he had a significant impact on reshaping of mid-19th century Europe. It was somewhat ironic that the forces of German nationalism destroyed him in 1870. Napoleon III remained neutral in the Austro-Prussian War. He had hoped to turn his neutrality to good advantage by mediating between the combatants and by threatening to join the war to persuade them to make peace on his terms, which would have had territorial gains for France. The speed and scale of Prussia's victory dashed Napoleon's hopes. When he attempted to mediate after the Battle of Sadowa, the offer was declined by Bismarck, who instead sent the Prussian ambassador to Paris to inform Napoleon that Prussian expansion would be limited to North Germany and that the South German states would remain independent. The division of Germany was presented to Napoleon as a reward for his neutrality during the war. Bismarck realized that Napoleon would regard a united Germany as a potential threat to France and feared that the emperor might march to Austria's assistance. After 1866, Napoleon was concerned by the situation in Germany. Prussia now controlled more than two-thirds of Germany, and it was unrealistic to suppose that the remaining third could or would continue an independent existence indefinitely. After the Treaty of Prague, Bismarck extended the Zoll to include the 4 South German states and involved them in the new Zoll Parliament. Although it was nominally concerned only with economic affairs, it seemed that the Zoll Parliament would be a further step towards full German unity. The 4 South German states did not present a united front, for they distrusted each other as much as they distrusted Bismarck. In addition, they distrusted Napoleon, with good reason. They believed correctly that he had designs on part of their territory as his reward for French neutrality during the 7 Weeks' War. In July 1866, the French ambassador in Berlin had presented detailed plans to Bismarck for France to acquire part of the Rhineland belonging to Bavaria and Hesse. This idea was firmly rejected by Bismarck, who did not want to give away any German territory to France. But nor in the mid-1866 did he want to alienate Napoleon. He therefore suggested that France should look for expansion not in the Rhineland, but further north in the French-speaking areas of Belgium and Luxembourg. Having missed the chance to check Prussia's growth of power in 1866, Napoleon needed a diplomatic and territorial success to prove that France remained Europe's greatest power. Luxembourg seemed to provide an opportunity for Napoleon. Bismarck's policy on the Luxembourg question is difficult to unravel. He began by helping Napoleon to persuade the King of the Netherlands, who was also the Duke of Luxembourg, to relinquish the duchy. The king, short of money and with no real interest in Luxembourg, readily agreed. However, Prussia also had certain rights in Luxembourg, in particular to garrison the fortress. This right dated from the Vienna settlement of 1815, which had made the fortress part of the German Confederation. By the end of 1866, Bismarck was feeling much less need to be friendly towards Napoleon, who was stirring up demonstrations in Luxembourg against the hated domination of Prussia. Partly in response to this and partly to encourage nationalist sentiment, Bismarck now began to refer to Luxembourg as German and announced that its surrender to France would be a humiliating injury to German national feelings. He declared, if a nation feels its honor has been violated, it has in fact been violated, and appropriate action must ensue. We must, in my opinion, risk war rather than yield. Anti-French sentiment increased throughout Germany. Why did Bismarck encourage this nationalist hysteria? It seems unlikely that he wished to start a war with France at this stage. The Prussian army needed time to recover from the Austrian War, and the North German Confederation was still fragile. Perhaps his intention was to start a campaign of provocation to drive Napoleon into war in due course. Perhaps rather than leading, he was himself partly led by German nationalists who he knew he could not afford to alienate. In March 1867, Bismarck released the secret military alliances he had made with the South German states to the public. These showed that the North German Confederation and the 4 southern states were not as independent of each other as had been assumed. Napoleon and Bismarck now met head-on in a series of diplomatic battles. Napoleon began negotiations with the King of the Netherlands, playing on the king's fears that Prussia was after a slice of Dutch territory and offering to protect the Netherlands in return for Luxembourg. From Napoleon's point of view, the king wrecked the scheme by agreeing to sell Luxembourg for 5 million guilders, subject to the approval by the King of Prussia. This, he must have known, was not likely to be given. Indeed, Bismarck used the patriotic German fervor he had encouraged as an excuse to threaten the King of Netherlands not to give up Luxembourg. Bismarck now appealed to the great powers to settle the Luxembourg question. At a conference in London, it was agreed that the Prussian garrison should be withdrawn, and that Luxembourg's independence and neutrality would be guaranteed by the great powers. While the outcome of the London Conference seemed like a compromise, the fact that there was no territorial gain for France was a heavy blow for Napoleon. The Luxembourg crisis seriously damaged Franco-German relations. Nevertheless, the years of 1867 to 70 were peaceful. Bismarck was still keen to avert war. Fearful of French military strength, he was also concerned that Napoleon might find allies. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, hankering after regaining influence in Germany, twice met Napoleon in 1867 to see whether it was possible to reach an agreement. Fortunately for Bismarck, these efforts came to nothing. There was no real basis for an agreement. Franz Joseph was aware that most German Austrians totally opposed a pro-French and anti-Prussian policy. The Luxembourg crisis has been seen as a point at which Bismarck stopped being a Prussian patriot and became a German one. However, there is no evidence that Bismarck himself thought this. He stirred up and used German national feelings quite cynically as a means to increase Prussian influence over the rest of the German states, as well as a weapon against France. He now wanted a united Germany under Prussian control, but knew that this was unlikely to happen overnight. Only a war with France, which raised national consciousness and brought all Germans together, was likely to speed up this process. In a long interview which Bismarck gave to the British journalist in September 1867, he spoke of his wish for peace. "There is nothing in our attitude to annoy or alarm France. There is nothing to prevent the maintenance of peace for 10 or 15 years, by which time the French will have become accustomed to German unity, and will consequently have ceased to care about it." In this interview, Bismarck presented himself as a man of peace. He wanted to ease British fears about Prussian warlike intentions and to reduce the chance of British alliance with France. He made use of such methods to present himself and his policies in a favorable light. He understood very well the value of a good public relations system. This makes it difficult to judge his true intentions from his public utterances. He did not always believe what he said or say what he believed. Another key question is, who was most to blame for the Franco-Prussian War? In 1868, the Queen of Spain, Isabella II, was driven out of the country by a revolution. The Spanish government made efforts to find a new monarch among the royal houses of Europe. In February 1870, an official offer was made to Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern by the Spanish government. Leopold's father referred the request to Wilhelm I, who, as King of Prussia, was the head of the Hohenzollern family. Wilhelm, left to himself, would have refused consent. He knew that to proceed would provoke French hostility, for Napoleon would see it as a threat to encircle France with Hohenzollern monarchs in Berlin and Madrid, pursuing anti-French policies simultaneously. Wilhelm was persuaded to change his mind by Bismarck, who sent him a strongly worded memorandum. "It is in Germany's political interest that the House of Hohenzollern should gain, in esteem, an exalted position in the world." In the end, the king gave his consent, provided that Leopold himself wished to accept the throne. As Leopold did not want to do so, the affair appeared to end. However, Bismarck had secretly sent envoys to Spain with large sums of money as bribes to push Leopold's candidacy. He also put pressure on the Hohenzollern family, and as a result of which Leopold decided to accept after all. In June, Wilhelm gave his unconditional consent. Bismarck had planned that the document giving Leopold's acceptance would arrive in Spain, be immediately presented to the Cortes for ratification, and then the news be announced amid general rejoicing. However, the message, relating code through the Prussian embassy in Madrid, suffered an unforeseen mix-up of dates due to a cipher clerk's error. As a result, the Cortes was not in session when the document arrived, and before it could be recalled, the secret of Leopold's acceptance leaked out. The news reached Paris on July 3, 1870. Napoleon and his new aggressive foreign minister, Antoine Gramont, regarded Leopold's candidature as totally unacceptable. Moreover, they hoped to strengthen Napoleon's position at home by a resounding victory, diplomatically or otherwise, over Prussia. An angry telegram was sent to Berlin asking whether the Prussian government had known of Leopold's candidacy, and declaring that the interests of honor of France are now in peril. Count Benedetti, the French ambassador in Berlin, was instructed to go to the spa town at Ems, where Wilhelm I was taking the waters, to put the French case that Leopold's candidacy was a danger to France and to the European balance of power, and to advise Wilhelm to stop Leopold leaving for Spain if he wanted to avoid war. Wilhelm, who had no wish for war, assured the ambassador of Prussia's friendship for France, and on July 12 Leopold's father withdrew his son's candidacy. The affair appeared to have been settled, with the diplomatic honors going to France. Bismarck in Berlin spoke of humiliation and threatened resignation. He was saved from having to make good on his threat by Napoleon. Goaded by Gramont, the French emperor now overplayed his hand. Leopold's renunciation had been announced in a telegram from his father to the Spanish government. Now France demanded an official renunciation from Wilhelm I on behalf of Leopold for all time, and the French ambassador was ordered to see the king again and obtain his personal assurance. They met on July 13th. Wilhelm found this deeply insulting and refused to give the assurances demanded, since he had already given his word. Even so, his reply was conciliatory. As a matter of course, he instructed one of his aides to notify Bismarck in Berlin of the day's events in a telegram. He also gave Bismarck permission to communicate details to the press. That evening in Berlin, Bismarck, dining with Generals Moltke and Roon, received the telegram from Ems. Having read it, Bismarck, in the presence of my two guests, reduced the telegram by striking out words, but without adding or altering anything. The shortening of the text had the effect of making the king's message to the French ambassador appear to be an uncompromising response to the French demand to renounce support for the Hohenzollern candidature for all time. Bismarck ensured that the amended text of the Ems telegram was published in newspapers in Berlin. Prussian embassies received copies of the text by telegram with instructions to communicate the contents to foreign governments. When Wilhelm saw the published version, he is said to have remarked with a shudder, "This is war." As Bismarck had anticipated, the publication of the amended Ems telegram caused eruptions in France. French newspapers, convinced that French honor was at stake, demanded war. Napoleon, urged on by his wife, his ministers, and the Chamber of Deputies and public opinion, declared war on Prussia on July 19th. It seems likely that Bismarck was prepared to fight a war against France from 1866 onwards, as long as it could appear to be a defensive war brought about by French aggression. Such a war would almost certainly bring the South German states into the Prussian fold. All that he needed was a suitable opportunity, and this occurred with the Hohenzollern crisis, and Bismarck took full advantage of it. However, there is little evidence that he was set on war from 1866 or even in 1870. He certainly did not control the whole of the Hohenzollern affair, nor was it simply opportunity on his part that led to war. Equally important was a series of French diplomatic blunders. Moreover, the French emperor and people in 1870 were ready to fight before the Ems telegram was published. If Bismarck set a trap for France, it was largely one of France's own making. Bismarck, claiming that France was the aggressor who had committed a grievous sin against humanity, called on the South German states for support in accordance with the terms of their military alliances with Prussia. Convinced that the fatherland was in danger, they agreed to support Prussia.